Thank you very much, Nadia, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. So my talk is entitled The Future of Political Islam. A couple of quick caveats. The political Islam should be firmly in scare quotes and other indicators and diacritical marks suggesting that I'm not quite sure what that means, because indeed, as you'll hear later on, the question of what political Islam is today is precisely part and parcel of the analysis that I want to offer. I will say this by way of offering a stipulative definition or explanation of the kind of scope that I'll be addressing this afternoon, which is that when I'm talking about political Islam or Islamism, I'm going to be referring first and foremost to those groups and movements that operate within the confines of formal political systems. So those Islamist groups and movements that at some point in the evolution of their careers made the decision to enter formal politics, to offer themselves to the electorate. So that's the type of political Islam that I'm going to be focused on in this talk. I'll say right up front also that I'm not going to confidently declare a future for political Islam. There's this allergy in the room to prediction, and I think that's wholly appropriate given our track record on these issues and given the fluidity of things going on in this particular region. So really at best what I want to highlight are a number of trends which in turn yield possible directions, so sort of trends and directions, rather than declaring any particular future. I think it's fair to say that at sort of level of common public discourse and punditry, what you tend to get around the question of political Islam right now is a sort of what I call the rise and fall narrative, that in the immediate aftermath of the Arab uprisings, Islamist parties ascended very rapidly in terms of their political influence, being the primary benefactors politically in the immediate aftermath of the dramatic revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, only to kind of equally precipitously fall from power, right? In this sense that, well, political Islam of that sort is done. It's a spent force. It had its chance and it failed. And sort of I think that's a common narrative. You need only to kind of look beyond the sort of cases of particularly Egypt, I think. And I think this rise and fall narrative is itself indicative of a very sort of common error that you find in those who observe and analyze political Islam, which is to take the, I think, increasingly exceptional and outlying case of Egypt and try to read the entirety of political Islam by reference to that one case, which again I think is increasingly the exception rather than the rule when it comes to Islamism in the Middle East. You need only to expand beyond Egypt and Tunisia, say, to actually find a much more complex picture with respect to political Islam, right? In Morocco, the party with by far the largest number of seats in parliament and the party that holds the largest number of cabinet positions in that country's ruling coalition is, of course, the Party of Justice and Development, essentially the Moroccan branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. In Jordan, a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood holds the largest block of seats, opposition bloc in that country's parliament. We have Islamists that have performed well in elections also recently in Kuwait. There's the ambiguous case of Turkey and the Islamistness or not of the AKP. We have elections coming up in Lebanon this weekend. It'll be very interesting to see how Hezbollah and parties aligned with it do. So, a much more complex picture that suggests that political Islamism is anything but a spent force. And indeed, various public opinion polls, and it's, I should say, very difficult to do good polling on these kinds of questions right now, but those who have tried And let's factor in a huge margin of error here for some of these very reasons. But the numbers that we see out of polls suggest that in various countries around the region, Islamist groups and movements still continue to enjoy somewhere between 25 to 34% in terms of their favorability ratings, right? So even at the level of society, these groups seem to have some ongoing relevance. That all said, I want, and this is where I'm kind of moving into the kind of central thrust or the kind of middle heart section of my remarks, is to kind of point to what I take to be the kind of major longer-term trends that have been developing over the last few decades that kind of shape the broader social and political infrastructures in which these parties operate, and the kind of trends that I think are likely to be shaping the future of political Islam. So the first of these is an enormous diversification, a sort of process of proliferation in terms of the number of actors in society defining themselves in reference to Islam and claiming to be options that people in society have for embracing an Islamic answer or alternative or solution for life, right? It used to be, back in the back in the good old days of when we knew who the Islamists were and what they stood for, that when you wanted the Islamic option, there was a very particular group and movement that you joined. Starting from the late 90s, particularly in the 2000s, fueled by media and I think changing patterns of political economy in society, social class dynamics, the rise of new patterns and practices of consumption, you began to see more and more actors out there taking market share away from the traditional hegemonic actors in the religious field, such as the Muslim Brotherhood. So part and parcel of this kind of broader trend, I think, is just a broadening of the range of entities and options that are available to people in the Middle East who want to find some way of integrating Islam into their life, even as something like a lifestyle movement. So there's that. I think it's also fair to say, and I think this trend here is captured by some of the analysis that's gone on around the whole discussion of post-Islamism and the work of people like Olivier Roy and Asef Bayat, is a sort of increasing diffuseness in the agenda of Islamism, right? This trend whereby as Islamist parties sought to capture political market share, to offer themselves to electorates at the ballot box, they found that they were more successful when they downplayed those dimensions of themselves that made them ideologically distinctive, right? So almost the less they talk about Sharia, the more likely they are to get votes, right? And so you seem to increasingly have this trend whereby Islamist parties, the more politically prominent they become, the less they seem to talk about religion or define themselves in terms of specific understandings of religion or offer particular solutions and policies defined in terms of religion. So diversification of the range of Islamic actors, increasing diffuseness in the Islamist agenda. And then I think it's also fair to say that there's a sort of shift in the underlying sociology with respect to what people who are attracted to Islamist movements or join them or support them, what they understand themselves to be doing when they move towards these groups. And so this I think involves a sort of inversion of the conventional analytical lens, right? So much of the literature on Islamism is really focused on looking at specific groups and movements, tracing the careers of specific organized entities. And that's interesting and worthy, and if you're interested in that approach to the question, there's a project that Will McCants and Shadi Hamid and I developed at the Brookings Institution back in late 2014 called Rethinking Political Islam, which was basically looking at how Islamist parties were reacting to the coup in Egypt in 2013 and this sort of pivotal shift with respect to Islamism in the region. And so, that's a great book if you want to kind of look at it from the movements and groups approach. I'm in a way more interested in the question of how those in society, a sort of more bottom-up question about how people think about and understand what Islamism means, what that means today. And I think you get some really interesting sense of that from the work of people like Avi Spiegel, and some of you may be familiar with his recent book, Young Islam, that came out in the Princeton Muslim Politics series, where he looks at young supporters of Al-Adl wal-Ihsan in Morocco and PJD in Morocco. And through this work of political ethnography, you get the sense of a lot of young people who are drawn towards Islamism not because they are supporters of a particular set given ideology that is well defined in its contours and its objectives and its policy goals, but more the idea that Islamism functions as a generic symbol for the possibility of something different than the status quo, something other than those who are currently in power, even though the sort of exact content of it is unclear, and the sense that we'll figure that out as we go along. Right? And so, a younger generation that isn't drawn to Islamism because there's a clear ideological model there that they're attracted to, but because it functions as a symbol of something different. And I heard this very clearly in a session that we did in Tunis this last fall, where we brought together a variety of activists and civil society figures from across the region, from diverse points on the ideological spectrum, to kind of talk about the future of pluralism in the Arab world. And if you're interested in it, we did a report out of that just came out with the Halling Center a few weeks ago. And what came through there is this very clear sense of the idea that conventional categories of politics and political identity are increasingly meaningless for making sense of Arab politics. That this idea of asking, is this person a secularist? Are they a liberal? Are they a leftist? Are they an Islamist? That people aren't really thinking of themselves in reference to those kinds of categories now. It's a much more polarizing situation where it's, are you with or against the regime, right? It's organized around much more immanent and existential questions than things like ideological categories. So then, where if we take these broad trends and we kind of turn them into possible future directions, what might that yield? And so, as I wind down my remarks now, I want to just take note of a sort of few things that I'm thinking about and keeping my eye on in terms of the forces that will likely shape the course of Islamism in the Middle East going forward. So I think first is a distinctly changing calculus on the part of Islamist parties with respect to the question of political participation. Does it make sense to participate, right? Is that a useful strategy? Can you actually achieve anything through that, right? With certainly the Egyptian case being a cautionary tale, even the Tunisian case being a cautionary tale. Obviously, in a number of the countries we've talked about, Jordan, Morocco, there's always been a certain political ceiling. Even in the case of Morocco, even when Moroccans win, they're not in control. They don't actually have political power. Most Islamists operating in that kind of environment have tended to sort of, domesticate themselves, self-censor, adapted to the constraints that they're faced with, and that obviously has had an impact on their ability to actually pursue anything like a distinctive political agenda. But I also think the cautionary tale that comes from the cases of Egypt and Tunisia is the idea that it's very easy to not be in power and yell about the inequities and evils of the regime, but then once you are in a position of political prominence, once you have state power, there's suddenly the expectation that you're going to get things done and solve problems. And that's not easily accomplished, given the magnitude of socioeconomic contradictions, for example, that are present in many of these countries. So maybe it would be better to kind of retrench ourselves within the movements, right? The great many of these Islamist parties began life as, and in many cases continue to have, social movement variants of themselves. And so one possible trend might will be quite happy to make that possible. Conversely, if and when he feels that more political space for Islamists gets in the way of certain sorts of broad strategic goals, he will enforce that kind of position as well. So that's where I'm looking. And the final remark I'll make, and this is in relation to the scare quotes around political Islam. You know, I've been teaching courses on this subject for 20-some years, and I never feel more unconfident than I do these days getting up in front of the class on the first day of this semester and explaining what the course is about, just because I don't really know what political Islam is about anymore. The term post 9/11, has inflated to be used in the media and policy discussion as a sort of label or reference that is trying to capture everything from, Al-Qaeda and ISIS to the Muslim Brotherhood, to the Fethullah Gulen movement, to Al-Adl wal-Ihsan, just so many different groups and movements with such widely ranging objectives and origins and goals, that I think there's this relevant ongoing question with respect to what this term actually means and what analytic utility it has. And that's not coincidental that you've seen in the last few years this spate of articles and books with titles like "What is Political Islam?" Because I'm not even all that sure that we know what it means anymore. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.